most important thing that we can do is foster human connection whenever we can. And then secondly, create a very powerful story, a very powerful new collective narrative for our society and for the organizations that are part of it. And I think then I'm optimistic.
And is the pronunciation Leberecht?
Perfect.
Yeah.
It means live right, do the right thing.
Oh.
It's a moral imperative, so to speak.
No pressure.
No pressure. I'm trying to live up to it. Live right.
Welcome to Heja Framtiden. This is the Swedish podcast about the future in a sort of an optimistic approach. At least we're trying. I'm sitting here at SIME 2019 at Epicenter in Stockholm with Tim Leberecht. Welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here.
German-American.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I was born and raised in Germany, lived there for about 30 years, and then I moved to Los Angeles for grad school, met my wife there, and then was lucky enough to find a job in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley and worked in the design and innovation industry for 14 years, and then recently moved back 3 years ago to Berlin, where I'm based now.
Okay. And you are here in Stockholm now to talk about your new book, right? And topics.
An old book or a book that came out in 2015, and then one that I actually have to submit to my publisher in a few weeks. I'm really under the gun. Okay. So the one that I was mostly talking about was The Business Romantic. That came out a few years ago, and it has evolved in terms of what I'll talk about on stage. And then, but just in a conversation with Ola, the founder and organizer of SIME or SIME, we were also talking about my new book, which is going to be about losing.
Yeah, so let's start with the business romantic idea. What is it that you mean with the business romantic phrase or the approach?
Well, I was trying to bring together two qualities that don't seem to belong to each other. In fact, if you hear the words business and romance, it's like two opposites that don't attract one another. So in business, often when we say you are romantic or don't romanticize, we mean it in a derogatory, negative fashion. And I just feel that's a grave mistake, because when we look at the future of work, it's increasingly clear that it's not going to be just a battle of data. And it's not just about efficiency, especially not when it comes to human work. Machines will do everything anything that can be automated and that can be done efficiently will be done more efficiently by AI and robots, very likely. So what remains to do for us humans is the kind of work that must be done beautifully, like a romantic would do it, with care, with imagination, with empathy, with emotional intelligence. So all the gray stuff, the fluffy, elusive stuff that sits between clear truths, that is our dominant, that's our domain. That's what we're really good at, relationships that are really gray and fuzzy. And my book and this idea of business romanticism was an attempt, or is an attempt, to bring that back into the business conversation.
And you even, you don't even stop at the phrase soft skills. You go one step further. You said, I just read a headline somewhere that you promoted sort of sentimental skills in a way.
Yeah, soft skills.
What do you mean by that?
I think soft skills is it's good that we're seeing a rise of soft skills and that they're gaining more traction.
But the phrase itself is a bit...
I feel like soft is maybe not... or it's still used often in a dismissive fashion. There are sort of the hard competencies and the hard skills, and at the end of the day, when you're in the boardroom or in a meeting, they're going to be decisive.
Yeah, he's good with the soft
right?
skills.
He's good with the soft skills, or she's good with the soft skills, he's good with the soft skills, but whoever has the numbers wins. When it comes down, when the rubber hits the road, it's about numbers and the hard competencies. So what I really mean is that I like this term of a sentimental education. It just means that it's not just about emotional intelligence to then become more productive or to manipulate your customers or business partners into doing what you want them to do or facilitating transactions, selling more products. Sentimental education means that the entire way of showing up at work and leading an organization is based not only on science or on data or on the ruthless logic of the bottom line, but it's also based on ethos, on aesthetic intelligence, on emotion. So all the things that we can learn from disciplines we have long considered frivolous, the humanities and the arts. And I think effective leaders increasingly will have to become very adept at embracing the humanities and the arts and ideas that are outside of the very narrow business mainstream. And I think that's what I mean by sentimental education. So soft skills alone, good start, but not good enough.
It sounds like a great mix between your European heritage and your American career. So,
yeah, in a way, it's really a homecoming for me. So I left Germany in 2003, went to grad school, and then I worked in Silicon Valley for a while. I was quite intrigued by the optimism that is so refreshing if you grow up in Germany and people always find a reason not to do things. And then you go to Silicon Valley and the question is, so who's doing that already? And you say, well, no one. And they say, great. And it's exactly the opposite in many European countries in my experience. So I love that. But at the same time, I also felt after living there for 14 years that there's something missing. There's a certain heritage missing, or a notion of sort of a code of human interaction that just has been taken over completely by the market society. I think in many ways in the US it's a very capitalist system. And I miss that. And I think here in Europe, we still have a different fabric. It's not just a market society. There are different values. There's sort of hidden layers of code. And so, yeah, I think the book was, in a way, was a homecoming for me. And then consequently, I guess a few years later, I actually moved back. And I think Europe is super interesting right now because there's so much change. It's in such a crisis as well. But it's just, I think what Europe will do, or how Europe is reinventing itself, will definitely be a beacon for the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's nice to hear because many people view Europe as some sort of lazy fat cat that is not up to speed with China and US when it comes to technological development. But as you say, maybe we have something else. I mean, the history is surrounding us in every step we take. And that maybe can be useful in a way.
I think so. I mean, I am worried that we are, left behind. I mean, I just heard this morning, right? China's investment in AI is 15 billion, Germany's is 5 billion. And of course, China and the US, when it comes to artificial intelligence, are so advanced that I don't think we can compete in terms of just technological prowess. But I think what is inherently European and what Europe has recognized is, well, we understand ethics.
Exactly.
And Europe is now the super regulator with GDPR, which has been, whatever you think of it, the bottom line, it has been very effective and has really changed the conversation for many American and Chinese companies as well.
The expert panel in the European Commission is debating AI ethics and AI sustainability.
And now just in Germany, there's now an initiative basically introducing an AI check, right? Sort of a structure, an audit basically for AI. So, this is not just, I'm not saying this is all great. I'm often really annoyed by the bureaucracy and sort of the regulatory issues and all the nitpicky regulation here in Europe. But at the same time, if there's one thing that we're really good at, is we understand sort of the social contract between organizations and individuals. And I think we understand also how fragile society is. We have now established ourselves as the super regulator for what it's worth. And I think there's a really important role to play. Will that help us, sustain our standard of living in the future? Who knows?
How can we teach ourselves and our kids to be more business romantic?
I think it's, first of all, very important, and that is a very romantic trait, to recognize that there's not only one truth. So that always frightens me when people say, oh, but that's what the numbers say, or that's what this ideology says. And I think romantics understand there's always another door, there's always another world out there. We can imagine it, we can build it, and there is not just one truth. Specifically speaking, what that means for education, and I have a 10-year-old daughter myself, is I think it's just...
me too.
You too? Mm. So it's just, I always wonder, what skills are really important, because is it math? Is it coding? I don't know, maybe not. But I think what is so important is is that you speak other languages. It doesn't even matter what these languages are, but I think it's just important that you train yourself to listen to another sound, another reality, another truth, and that you read, that you go to the theater, that you just see other forms of life, and that you embrace them, and so that you become very agile and very flexible in also changing yourself as required. So I think, I don't know if that's romantic, but I would say that's a core quality or competence that children or that we all should acquire to be future fit.
Yeah, I read some study about bilingual kids, which concluded that they are in a way more empathetic because they can see themselves from another person's perspective. So maybe there's something there. And I feel like when you're talking, there's a lot of clues to be found in literature, probably. Reading more, getting into complex storylines and see other perspectives than your own.
Absolutely. And
maybe that's
absolutely
a key to this.
Absolutely. And, I'm quite fascinated by the work of the Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa, who wrote stories with so-called heteronyms. So he basically assumed personas and different names. And it's almost like avatars, virtual alter egos to describe different truths. And yeah, I think it's just very important that our playing field remains wide and that we're not boxed into this narrow straitjacket of the quantified self, where all of our relationships are measured and optimized, where all of our skills are only measured against employability, but that we actually are able and have the freedom to actually form an identity. Because if we don't form an identity and have a sense of identity, then the social fabrics of our societies will erode, and we're seeing this a little bit already, that I think they're becoming very fragile because people don't have a sense of belonging, don't know who they are and who they belong to. That, for me, is like the most important responsibility of education, not just employability.
Yeah, and maybe a vast inner universe can also lead to more interesting solutions. You can see patterns in a different way.
Absolutely, and it's interesting, for example, that the founders of Airbnb were designers, and that so many disruptive ideas that are now have created our new reality, that they were laughed at. They were ridiculous, really ridiculous, because they were like fools or children's ideas where people said, "Are you kidding me? That's never gonna work." Renting your room out to strangers whom you don't know, giving them your apartment. So it's often those really outlandish ideas that come from a vast inner universe, and so of a blind faith in the possibility of another world or yourself imagining a different world. I think that's very much at the core of an entrepreneur or a startup founder. So they're all, I think, romantics at heart, even though at some point, of course, when growth pressures kick in and VCs come on board, that romantic flame is very much in jeopardy, and it's very hard to sustain it. But the most successful ones, they do.
And what about the new project, The Future Belongs to You, Losers? What do you mean by that?
So I was really annoyed by this talk about failing fast that is coming out of Silicon Valley, and it's this meme to say, well, it's all excusable, we can fail fast and then we'll build better, build faster even after that. And we have fuck up nights at some organizations, and I think it's important, especially in a country that I now live in Germany, it's still very hard to fail. But failing is not the same as losing. And losing really means, I think losing is probably the sentiment of our time. There's a lot of fear right now that people have that they're losing their status, losing security, losing their way of life. And it's I think to a large part, it's the middle class, and it's, the lower ends of the middle class that are now sliding down, I think, into lower income situations, and it's a material loss. I think the stability that we're so used to is no longer there because of the gig economy and some of those disruptive forces of the digital economies. But it's also a psychological and emotional sense of losing, that you are losing your home, maybe your identity, your sense of agency, that the world is just passing by and changing fast, and you have absolutely no control, no impact over it, and you don't even know where to start. So I'm very interested in unpacking losing, and I think with this book, I want to make losing palpable. I want us to have a conversation about losing without saying, oh, it's losing is great as long as it's failing and you kind of reinvent yourself and then you do better and greater. Losing is really, I think, the way a society treats those who quote unquote lose it shows really how civilized the society is. And I think we will all be losing in some shape or form in the future. And I think we have to come to grips with that. And it starts with language. It starts with understanding what does losing mean? How do you respond to it? How do you cope with it? Can you lose without being stigmatized as a loser? And I look at...
Because it's not an identity. I mean, you
it's
don't
not
wanna,
an identity. Yeah,
you're not
exactly.
saying that losers are the future.
No,
but we all lose stuff.
Yeah,
people.
Exactly. I just want to find new rituals and ways to cope with losing and integrate that into our life, rather than treating it as the exception that one doesn't talk about and that is just marginalized and pushed out of the conversation. I want it at the center of our conversation and find ways for us as a society to deal with it, to have conversations about it.
Maybe loss is a better word sometimes.
Loss is something I look at as well. But loss and losing is different insofar, in my view, that loss is an event. So you might lose a loved one, you might lose your job, but there is a cathartic element to it. So it's a defeat, but it's kind of like a pierce moment. It punctuates your life, and then you can recover from it, or you make sense of it. In some cases, losing means, I think, is more like a continuous sentiment. It's this feeling that, I'm slowly losing my agency. I'm slowly losing my place in society. I'm slowly losing my status. And that's grinding. And that in some ways, perhaps it's more brutal than a loss when you're fired or, and even though, of course, sometimes the economic consequences can be brutal. But I think losing is just this sense that your agency is slipping through your fingers. And I think that usually doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't lead to recovery. It leads just to despair and depression. And I think then we have very disengaged, members of our society. In Germany, there was a study that just came out that showed that there's basically 1/3 of the population that the study called the invisible third. So they're very disengaged. They're very disconnected. They don't have a sense of a collective narrative. They don't feel they have any agency. I mean, you would probably say they all have a sense of losing out and no longer being part of this society. And that's like hugely explosive, that we don't talk about that, or we don't deal with that more urgently.
Okay, so you're not saying that this is a positive thing. You're saying that this is something you fear.
I fear that
we don't talk about it.
Yeah, I fear that we don't talk about it. I fear that we disengage, and I fear that we speak of losers, that we divide into winners and losers, and that people who have to suffer through profound changes in their lives, that they consider themselves and stigmatize themselves with the loser label, rather than understanding that this is just a real a part of the human condition, and we should create ways in society to allow them to still be integrated, even though they're not the successful startup entrepreneur or the corporate manager who has a progressive linear career and is moving up the corporate ladder and drives, their sports car. Because all of that is going to change. And I think, I think it's important that we change the language in our talk shows, in our newspapers, in the way we lead the public discourse. Oh my God, this is such a depressing topic. Can we just talk about something else? Why did I write a book about this?
Seriously. No, but it's also. I mean, I see connection to the incel community, of course, as well as ISIS. I mean, there are frustrated men, basically, that feel that they are losing something. They have to find an opponent that they can struggle and fight against, right? But isn't it also a matter of masculinity?
It's a really interesting question. When my book came out, The Business Romantic, many people came up to me after the talks and said, wow, this is kind of a very feminist narrative that you're promoting here, because all the qualities and traits you're talking about are very feminine. And I think to some degree that's true. So I say this sort of in a gender-neutral way. But yeah, I do believe that the skills needed in the 21st century are feminine ones, absolutely. And would the world be a better place if we had more feminine traits in power and, in fact, more women in power? There's absolutely no question about it. There is a huge crisis of masculinity because men are very confused. The role models that used to work in the past are no longer working. You have to be soft and hard at the same time. You need to provide security and need to be firm at the same time. You're now expected to be empathetic and vulnerable. At the same time, women have been dealing with these issues for a long time, so it's kind of time for men to catch up and really.
Maybe it's a confusing transition period.
It is maybe a confusing transition period, but I think cracking that nut, what masculinity means, again for all genders and how we can reap its benefits, is really important. And it's true if you look at, extremism and disenfranchised populations that. It is a lot of men. It's to a large degree. It's men. And look at Trump voters. Also, I think it's white men who are worried about their status and their sense of belonging, their place in society, because the world is changing. And aside from extremist ideologies like Trump's and very clear populist messages, there is maybe not enough guidance for them to reinvent themselves in light of all these exponential changes.
I mean, there's something comforting in choosing a side, of course. That's why polarization happens, I guess. When you're confused and there's someone saying, I know how things work, they are the enemy, then it's really easy to catch on, of course. But how can we break that? I mean, talking about losing is one thing, but can we go even? Can we do it preemptively?
I think it's important that, and this is maybe one criticism that can be leveled against the West or liberal societies, that maybe we have been living too long in sort of this vanilla state of mind where we took things for granted and thought, well, yeah, let's take a measured approach, very pragmatic. Let's listen to all sides. We don't have to put our foot down. I think now there's probably a realization that, well, we have to take sides too. Other people are taking sides, and maybe it's important for us to define a new project, a new social project, and defend our values and define what they are. So that's maybe one thing. And then in terms of avoiding this erosion of our societies or disenfranchisement, I think there's a lot of measures that can be done. I mean, one is to use online and offline measures to put people together who otherwise would not meet. That's becoming very rare, right? When do we actually meet people who are not like us online? At work, maybe, but even at work, right? We're increasingly, of course, dealing with sort of these bubbles of people who are like us and happy and collaborative and creative, at least in these strata of the creative economy that I guess you and I travel in. But there are efforts to use recommendation engines to put people in touch with each other. There is an organization called More in Common, which is led by a friend of mine, Mathieu Lefebvre, that has done research on what actually divides us and what can connect us. And there are initiatives such as neighborhood weekends in the UK, where neighbors hang out with their people hang out with their neighbors that they may not have seen or met actually in years, because everybody's stuck in their homes. So there's all kinds of initiatives through the help of algorithms or just narrative to connect people who otherwise wouldn't have met. And I think the power of conversation, of small dinners, of small events, of intimate conversations is really, really important. And another initiatives are change dinners, for example, in the US, or a dinner series where people talk about death and their death experiences or their fear of death. And that's also a very intimate connection. So any small units of intimacy, and intimacy is really something I think, or a word that I like that's very much needed in this context, I think can help us further this or rebuild this contract. But there's no silver bullet. I think it's a number of small measures.
And I mean, this is obviously an event for business leaders. Do you think businesses in general can be better at promoting these skills and values and communicating them in a better way, also externally?
Business is, for what it's worth, right? It is the most important operating system of our time. And it is the paradigm, and increasingly also reaching into our private lives, of course, and how we design our relationships on a personal level. We spend 65, 70, even 75%, I believe, the majority of our waking hours at work. So this is a really, really important experience for identity and how we present ourselves to the world, which is why workplaces have tremendous power and responsibility. And so, yes, they can create a culture of psychological safety. They can create a culture of diversity. By the way, not just gender diversity, but cultural, political, neurodiversity as well. Where it's okay to be different and be not the norm or the perceived norm. I think they have a tremendous responsibility to create intimacy, to really foster genuine human interaction. I always say a human workplace is a workplace where you can be happy, not just be happy, but also be sad and still be accepted. So again, it's a workplace where you can lose without being a loser, without being ostracized for it. And I think that's basically what they can role model. It's just incredibly hard because so many of the family-run businesses or European businesses with very strong foundation of values are now competing with, brutally numbers-driven, hyper-efficient machines. Speaking of Amazon and the likes, and they're eating their lunch, and it's just very hard to fend them off, and at the same time insist on European values. And and I just wish that they have the courage to stay the course, and I hope that they're going to be rewarded by customers who ultimately go to companies because they agree with their values and they feel like I'm treated like a human rather than going for the more convenient solution that an Amazon or so might present. But I think the jury is out.
It's interesting you say the European values. Of course, it's generalizing, but maybe that's one possible future that. I use a quotation mark now. European values can be efficient in building more humane business environment, and also look at sustainability goals and inclusion. That's not a question. I don't know.
It's definitely a wish. It's definitely a vision that I subscribe to. I mean, there's so many family businesses, for example, in Germany and in many other European countries, the whole Mittelstand, the hidden champions. And, with the car industry facing some real upheaval and no longer like the, born winners, I think there's going to be a lot of disruption in all the supplier and, the whole belt around them. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they cope with it. But yeah, I hope that the idea that work is not the center of life or not the only thing that matters for your identity, that there is a basic form of decency and there's a social contract that is based on, I think, like the implicit acknowledgement that things are very fragile if we don't guard them well. I think those are, to me, are all what I would call European sentiments, at least, if not values. And I think we have to very, very actively, very firmly embrace them, articulate them, promote them, make them part of our organizations. Because I think otherwise, it'll be we're in for a challenging ride.
Are you future optimistic in general?
It really depends on the day. So I think, what's today? Wednesday. Sometimes I wake up and we just hosted an event ourselves in Lisbon, the House of Beautiful Business, 750 people. And my co-founder, Till, he always says, the reason we're doing this, we want to bring out the best in people. And it's true for Simi or Syme and other conferences as well. When I see human gatherings and I see the amount of generosity and ingenuity and love and just like how profoundly thankful humans are for human connection, then I've been very optimistic because I just don't think that's not gonna change anytime soon, in spite of the most evil AI and most brutally efficient organizations. At the same time, I am worried that that there is a very unholy alliance of turbocharged capitalism, of populism, and of course now of algorithmic weapons of mass distraction and mass manipulation. And that's a very, very explosive mix in the wrong hands. And I do believe that we're in a transition. I think we live in very fragile times, and there is no new story, no new system emerging. And maybe there isn't one. Maybe there are multiple at the end of the day. But like the Romantic movement 200 years ago, it was also a transition, and and there is a dark side to it as well. I mean, it's led straight into nationalism, fascism, some parts of it. So I think now we're in a similar transition, and the Romantic movement can give us some cues here, but we also have to be very careful that we don't, that we don't confuse it with like the only, or that we don't take one ideology as the only guiding one. And so, I think a lot of things will break up. There's a lot of agony right now. And I think I said this earlier, the most important thing that we can do is foster human connection whenever we can. And then secondly, create a very powerful story, a very powerful new collective narrative for our society and for the organizations that are part of it. And I think then I'm optimistic.
Great. One of my last questions is always your best tip for making the world a better place. And I think you kind of answered that.
I think it reminds me of an article that I just read by Jonathan Franzen in the New Yorker, who was saying, well, even if we fail to prevent the climate disaster that is looming, those people will really survive, and who will have a place in a strong community. So I think my answer would be that the best thing you can do is, if you don't want to become part of a community, or if you want to be part of a community of people, then create it. Create community. Create community around the dinner table, create community at work, create community outside of work, create community among not like-minded people, create gatherings, create trips together, retreats, whatever it is. But I think that at the end of the day, it's, human relationships are the most exponential technology. And if you invest in that and you create community, I think then you're certainly making the world a better place.
Great. Do you have any good reading tip?
I recently read Anand Giridhara's Winners Take All, speaking of losing, the elite charade of changing the world, where he takes a very, very harsh but very realistic look at the world of philanthropy and social impact. I think is a must read. It's a sobering read, but I think it helps you clear your mind, and I think it points to some of the underlying structural issues of our time. So that one I highly recommend. Okay.
Who do you think I should interview?
I'm very interested in football coaches, but it's just a passion of mine. So I'm a big fan of Pep Guardiola, because I like, speaking of creating community, I think it's fascinating, the work of football coaches or any team coaches. Like, how do you inspire people so they deliver their best performance? How do they stick together? It's a collective, right? It's a certain philosophy. It's a community they create. And then at the same time, these football coaches, they're very good at losing and winning. They can lose any weekend, right? The next game is basically could be the last game. And I think also they understand the importance of play. And I think that's also really, really important. So I mean, everything is always at stake. It's just a game, of course. But I like the emotional disposition of a football coach. I think it has very much to do with how we should show up in the world in the future. There's a lot to learn from people like Pep Guardiola. I'm just a fanboy. But if you get him, I'll be listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim Leberecht. Check out timleberecht.com for more information. And your book will be out
It'll be out in May next year.
May 2020. Okay. Do you have a title yet?
Well, I write it in German. I'm not sure what the international title will be. It's Against the Dictatorship of the Winners.
Oh, okay.
Why the future belongs to losers.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome.
This is Heja Framtiden. Check out hejaframtiden.se. Follow us on social media. My name is Kishan von Essen. Thank you for listening.